Well, good morning. Good to be with you. I invite you to open the Bible this morning, book of Daniel, chapter 3. Daniel, chapter 3, and we're gonna spend our time there this morning. Probably what's a fairly familiar story, I think, to a lot of folks, but one of the things that happens a lot of times with the stories in Daniel, and that's where I'm going to spend my time today with you this hour, next hour, and this evening. These stories we typically teach to our children in their Bible classes when they're young, and we kind of consider them stories for the young people. But the truth of the matter is they're stories for exiles in Babylon, literally, and they have a lot to say to those of us who are older, past our youth. And I hope that over the course of today, maybe we'll go back and we'll together look at these stories with fresh eyes and come to perhaps a deeper and more robust appreciation for the profundity of these stories and for their ongoing relevance to our lives today. And so I ask you this morning to open with me to the book of Daniel, chapter 3, this famous story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. One of the things that happens a lot of times, though, is that we tend to read these stories in Daniel in isolation. And some of that's necessary. There's only so much you can cover at one time. But one of the things that happens is that we lose sight of how these stories are really commenting on each other and working together. Daniel chapter 3, the story of Daniel chapter 3 really starts in Daniel chapter 2. And remember in Daniel chapter 2, just to summarize it quickly, right, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And in that dream, he sees a great image or statue, and it's made of the four metals, right? The head of gold, and the chest of silver, and the thighs, and whatnot of bronze, and the lower legs of iron, with the feet of iron mixed with clay. Remember that vision? And Nebuchadnezzar calls in all his wise men to interpret that for him. Nobody can, because remember, part of Nebuchadnezzar's deal was you have to tell me what the dream was too, and nobody can do that, and everybody's frustrated. And Nebuchadnezzar's angry until Daniel shows up, and Daniel is able to both tell Nebuchadnezzar what the dream was and interpret it. And the interpretation Daniel gave, if you'll recall, was that the different parts of the image are successive kingdoms, are empires that will kind of rule over mankind. He begins by telling Nebuchadnezzar, "You are the king of gold, right? You're the head of gold." And so the Babylonian Empire represents kind of that golden top part. And then, but what that means is that Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar's dynasty and his empire and whatnot, they're not going to last forever. It means that his work will turn to dust and will be surpassed. That chest of silver will come eventually. And of course, we know that's now the Persian Empire, but the Persians won't last. The Bronze Empire will come in time. We now know that's the Greeks. And then the Iron Empire comes, and we know that today as the Romans. And of course, the point of the vision was not just merely to kind of give a roadmap to the next several centuries of human history. Part of the point of that vision was in the days of that fourth kingdom, what happens? There'll be a stone that comes and smashes the image, the human project of man building empire after empire after empire, each regime thinking that they're the pinnacle of civilization, that their reign will last 1,000 years, so to speak. And yet that stone that comes, made without hands, comes and crushes and turns to dust the work of mankind. And that is the beginning of the everlasting kingdom, the kingdom of God, right? You remember that. That's chapter 2. And Nebuchadnezzar is very impressed with Daniel's wisdom and insight, and that's when Daniel gets his first big promotion. And we turn the page then to chapter 3, and that's where we're at today. Have your Bible? Let's read a little bit. Let's start. Chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits. And he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, prefects, governors, counselors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And so the satraps, prefects, governors, counselors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And then the heralds loudly proclaimed, To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipes, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And therefore, at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. All right, and so here we go. This part of the story is familiar, right? We've read this before. Have you ever thought about the larger significance of what Nebuchadnezzar is doing? At the very beginning of this story, verse 1, it says he made an image. Where do you think Nebuchadnezzar got the idea of building an image? He's just recently had a dream, hasn't he? But in his dream, what's different between the image of the dream and the image he builds? Yeah, the image that he builds is only of one metal. What metal? His metal. His metal. There's no silver, there's no bronze, there's no iron. What's Nebuchadnezzar doing? Well, he's thinking like a pagan, right? And in the pagan mindset, even if there's fate, even if there's gods out there, humans, we can outsmart them sometimes, right? If we have a heads up of what they're thinking and what they're planning, then we can maybe through some religious manipulation and some sacrifices, maybe through just some sheer human cleverness, we can change the course of fated history. And so what Daniel has really done to Nebuchadnezzar's mind is he's kind of given Nebuchadnezzar a heads up on what the gods are planning, as it were. And now Nebuchadnezzar says, thank you very much. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to build an image. It's all of gold. And what do you do when you have a mind to make sure that your regime, your empire, your work lasts forever? You need to make sure that all your people are on board with this, right? What you need is a loyalty test. Because if something's going to happen to my empire, what's one of the most likely places the danger can come from? Coup, internal disloyalty, somebody wants to replace me. And so Nebuchadnezzar takes the dream and he runs with it, an image all of gold, and he wants people to submit. Why do people have to bow down to this image? For one simple reason, because Nebuchadnezzar said so. And if you don't bow down to that image, what does that say about your relationship with the regime, with Nebuchadnezzar, with his authority, with his plans, with his intentions, his dreams, his desires? What does that say? That says you're not a team player. That says you're not on board with this. Now Nebuchadnezzar gets to find out who follows him and who doesn't. Nebuchadnezzar takes a dream that was meant to humble him and turns it into all about him. I'm the head of gold. And that's what all that he seems to hear out of what Daniel said. And he runs with that. And so now the who's who of Babylon is invited. Did you notice that list of who's invited? It's the who of his empire. All levels of government, all sorts of functions in his administration are brought now to the plain of Dura, to this image of gold, of Babylon's longevity. And did you notice as well, as people are being brought together there in verse 7, as all these offices, all these functionaries are being brought together, he's trying to unify this distant and diverse empire under his leadership and authority. And did you notice in verse 7 that one of the things it says is that all peoples of every language. Now, I've read a story somewhere before in the Bible with a name that sounds kind of like Babylon, about basically all nations being gathered together in kind of rebellion against God's plan. You read that story somewhere too? Yeah. Did you know in Hebrew the word for Babel and the word for Babylon are the same word? It's the same story over again. And here now you've got another man who's risen to the top of the human pile, who thinks that he's going to assert his will, his way over God's intended reality. He wants to make a name for himself, right? We'll see that even more in chapter 4. When you go back and read that story. And so Nebuchadnezzar intends to unite all humanity under his reign and his reality. If the point of the dream that God gave Nebuchadnezzar was that other empires are going to follow, that his legacy was not going to be permanent, but that he instead then makes the entire statue of gold about him. And what a bold claim that is. You have a king here, folks, who missed the point. of what God was saying. The point to Nebuchadnezzar should have been, you need to get on God's side. You need to accept God's plan. You need to learn to follow the one true God rather than trying to make yet again a name for yourself. Only God's kingdom lasts. Because for whatever it's worth, Nebuchadnezzar, the silver kingdom's not going to last. The bronze kingdom's not going to last. Even the iron kingdom's not going to last. Only one kingdom's going to last. And that, Nebuchadnezzar, is the kingdom you need to follow. You need to get on board with. You need to follow that God and his regime. I mean, after all, the sad thing about Babylon's empire is it was one of the shortest of them all. It doesn't even last the entire century. But Nebuchadnezzar wants to make it all about him. He wants to challenge God's view of history and God's plans for the future. So now we keep reading. If that's what's going on, let's see what happens next. And so we begin reading again in verse 8. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music is to fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. And so Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego should be brought before him. All right, so it's fascinating that now when we begin to look at these three men who are willing to stand out in the crowd, think again about the setting. You have the who's who of Babylon gathered there. All sorts of languages and peoples are represented. Everybody who's anybody is there. Anybody who has any kind of political hopes or aspirations. Anybody who wants to stay in business. Anybody who wants to have a place in Babylonian, the social circles, Babylonian economics, Babylonian political power. Everybody's there. Everybody's bowing down. And one of the first things you notice about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is not only do they have to take on the king, they have to take on the crowd as well. It's the Chaldeans, it's those of the crowd who actually rat them out to the king. They were probably already being watched as Jews. In fact, that's the thing. They're called Jews. They all these other nationalities represented, but we all know about those Jews. They got some funny views. They got this quirky God, and they just won't let it go. They're already known as people who don't conform. Remember chapter 1, what happens? We always focus upon Daniel setting his heart, but Daniel wasn't alone in chapter 1, was he? Who was there with him? These same three guys. And so these Jews, Daniel and his friends, have already in a sense established that they will not play by Babylon's rules. And despite the fact that they refuse to play by Babylon's rules, they have yet anyways risen, been promoted, and are part of the who's who of Babylon. You know that's got to grate on the rule followers in the regime. You work with people like that sometimes, the rule followers, who can't stand it when somebody who thinks outside the box gets promoted over them or more empowered than they are. So here are the Chaldeans. Think about this. The Jews refuse to be good Babylonians, and yet here they are among us. They've got titles. They've got positions. They've been promoted. We're watching them. And folks, we need to learn the lesson right there that comes out immediately, that when people know that you serve a different God than the God of the world, and that you live by a different standard. When people know that you serve another God and therefore you will not fully participate in the culture, what's going on around us, that you live by principles in which you are striving for righteousness and holiness, that you go to church and you will be there no matter what, whether it's a Sunday or a Wednesday or anything else, then you are naturally going to be watched by people around you. People are naturally going to assume that you're self-righteous. People are naturally going to assume that the problem is with you, not with them. And they're going to resent you because your attempts to do what's right are going to remind them of the fact that they are not trying to do what's right. And by the way, what that also means is whenever you violate your Christian confession, people are going to call you on it. It could be a conversation at the office. Some sort of word, some sort of phrase, some sort of joke slips out of your mouth, and people are going to say, hey, I thought you were a Christian. Turns out you're no better than the rest of us. You're just one of us too. And so here we are in verse 8, and the three are ratted out. Why are they ratted out? Because they're probably being watched. People who claim to have ultimate truth, people who claim to know the one and only true God, are always a threat to any culture. And even until relatively modern history, political regimes and authority structures depended upon polytheism, in which the king himself was a god. He was part of the divine hierarchy. And anybody who claims there's only one true God, and it's not Caesar, it's not Nebuchadnezzar, is a threat to anybody who depends upon establishing their claims to power by authority. And so the three were probably already being watched. You can hear it now. You can hear it now. The Chaldeans running up to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, listen, we're team players. We bow down. We play by the rules. And we were watching these three because, we thought something like this might happen. Because when you take a stand for God, people are going to try to tear you down. Then and now. I think about what Jesus said in John chapter 18, beginning of verse 18. He said this. He said, if the world hates you, you need to know that it actually hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. But because you are not of the world, because I chose you out of the world, because of this, the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a slave is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. And so here they are, hated. Because the truth of the matter is the world hates God. They had good positions after chapter 2, but here they are. Everyone has to show up in the plain of Dura to bow down to this image. And so they show up. And so they did. And they did up to a point what was asked of them, because there's nothing wrong showing up in a certain place at a certain time. You go to work on Monday and you get the memo that there's going to be an all-hands-on-deck meeting at 11 o'clock. And so you go, because that's what this was like. And can you only imagine what the conversation must have been like them in the carpool that day? I wonder what this is about. Well, at least you guys are with me. Maybe they're wondering where Daniel was on that day. He knew to phone in sick. I don't know. But I also want you to think about if you're in their shoes and you realize where you're at and what's going on and what's being asked of you. And if you serve the one true God of heaven, you can't bow down. What are you going to do? Think about their situation. Think about all the ways they could have compromised, they could have rationalized if they had wanted to. They could have said to themselves, listen, we're gonna bow down, but when we bow down, we're gonna pray to God. We won't really worship the image. We're gonna bow down and we're gonna pray to God, and God knows our hearts, and that's gonna be enough. I mean, after all, you, me, the three of us, we know that an idol is nothing. We know there's nothing to this, so we're gonna bow down and we're gonna say our own separate prayer, the three of us, when the time comes. Okay? What do you think about that? Trying to look like you are part of the culture, even when it's directly insulting and assaulting God's rules, God's ways, God's covenant, God's reality. The truth of the matter is when you rationalize that way, participation in the world, what you're really doing is saying, I want to look like I'm part of the world, even though I still want in my heart, no, I'm not. I want the appearance of worldliness without the confession of godliness. People can't tell we serve a different God, folks, when there's nothing culturally distinct about us. And in a dark and dying world, that means sometimes doing what's right is going to lead you into conflict with the world. And that conflict may come at work, that conflict may come in your family, that conflict may come in your neighborhood, that conflict may come in some sort of social group that you are a part of, but it's going to lead to moments of conflict where you cannot bow down. In the crowd, at work, in our families, if people can't discern that there's a different sort of God at work in our lives, then maybe we need to ask ourselves who we really are faithful to. This is a story where literally everybody else is doing it. Think about the language of the story. All people of every language, the repetitions over and over again of all the offices, the roles, different administrators, the different corporate levels that have been called to this meeting. Literally everybody else is doing it. And yet the three young men of God have the courage not to do what everybody else is doing. It's fascinating, folks, how sometimes even we as adults will use lines of reasoning that we wouldn't accept from our teenagers. We don't accept, how many, those of us who have raised teenagers, have teenagers, have gotten through the teenage years with their own kids. When your teenager came to you and said, Mom and Dad, listen, I want to go because everybody else is going to be there. When our teenagers come to us and say, listen, Mom and Dad, everybody else is doing it. What do? Do we accept that? Well, that's a great point. I think you should go. That's not what we do. But isn't it funny, ladies and gentlemen, as adults sometimes, that we will, in moments of decision where there's a risk of conflict, we'll start rationalizing the same way we would not accept from our children. We'll start saying things and using phrases like, well, listen, that's just the way it's done at this company. It's just business. It's just how business gets done or is done. Or we'll have euphemisms. We'll do something that we know is wrong or participate in something that we know is dishonest, but it's standard operating procedure. Because that's how it works in the world, right? If you want to get ahead in the world, if you want to survive in the world, you do what you have to do when you have to do, even if you don't like it. Everybody gets their hands dirty sometimes. Oh, but I'm still a Christian, and I want people to know that. But here are three young men, ladies and gentlemen, who have no problem saying, we are in your kingdom, but Nebuchadnezzar, we're not of your kingdom. Or think about another way. Think about yet another way they could have rationalized. They could have said this. They could have said, listen, that as they had their little huddle real quick when they realize what's being asked and what's going to go on and what they're going to have to do and the decision they're going to have to make. The conversation could have been with the three of them huddling together. It could have gone like this. It could have been, our God has protected us this far. We've gotten these good jobs. We've gotten these positions. We've survived being taken captive. We've gotten a world-class education from Babylon University. We've been given good jobs. Surely God would not have brought us thus far, protected us this long, just to now have us throw it all away. Surely that's not God's plan for us. Just to have us throw everything away and even our own lives be burned up in the end. That doesn't sound like our loving God. Surely that's not his plan for my life. And so we fudge, because surely God would not want us to suffer for righteousness' sake. And so think about other ways the story could have gone in Daniel chapter 3. Right as the music starts to play, oh, look, there's a penny on the ground. I'll pick it up right now. Oh, look, my shoelace is untied. What a great time to bend over and tie it. See how any excuse will do in a moment when we understand what the import is and what the image is that we need to project to stay in the world's good graces. But these young men were willing to be found out. These young men were willing to literally stand up in a crowd where everybody else was bowing down, probably thousands of people. They were willing to be branded as different. They were willing to be branded as difficult on their next performance review. They were willing to be marked down by their supervisor as not a team player. They were willing to be called hateful, outsiders, ignorant, just plain stupid, because they were willing to give up their lives and their positions in Babylon, the greatest empire the world had yet seen. And so when it comes to you and I today, ladies and gentlemen, when the rubber meets the road, and you want to see if you're bowing down to the culture or not, if you're bowing down to the culture's gods and idols, I'll tell you, there's a lot of ways we can check ourselves. We can certainly look at our reputations in our families or in our workplaces or in our schools. We can look at how we spend our time and how we spend our money. I'll tell you, those are the two great sacrifices that we offer today, right? Money and time. Where do those go? And those are our gods. But we're still very tempted to bow at the end of the day to success, to position, money, authority, to the applause, the attention we get. Babylon today, and it's still Babylon out there. Babylon today still constantly throw things at us, things that replace God as our motivation, things that will compromise who and what we are for. But for these three, what's important for us to understand is, in one sense, they really had no decision to make that day. Why? Because that decision had already been made sometime before, back in Daniel chapter 1, right? A chapter we'll talk about next hour. But when you stop and think about it, back in Daniel chapter 1 and about verse 8 or so, when Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank, and so he sought permission from from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. The truth of the matter is, ladies and gentlemen, and young people especially who are in this room hear this, you make the crucial decisions not in difficult moments. You make the crucial decisions at the beginning of your adult life. You make the crucial decisions at the beginning of your career, at the beginning of your education. You make the decisions then, who you are, what values you're going to live by, and you start making choices right then and there, regardless of the outcome. You see, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, along with Daniel back in Daniel chapter 1, they seem to have already made a decision that they're not going to go by Babylon's rules. They're not going to eat the food. They're not going to participate in the regime. And if that gets them into trouble, so be it. You see, they weren't really expecting to have careers when they made that decision. Stop and think about it. That's a great way to get kicked out of school. That's a great way to get fired on the first day. They already had decided that they were not worried about the outcome of their lives in Babylon, because they knew they were exiles there, that was not really their home, and that was not really their world. And folks, you and I have to learn to understand that this country and this century and this city, this is not our home. And we need, and if you haven't done this already today, you need to start doing this, deciding that you are not worried about the outcome of your life in this world here and now, because you're not going to stay here. If you're young, you've got maybe 50 years. You're middle-aged, you've got 20 or 30 more years. You're older, you're already on the clock, but you know that. The older we get, the easier it is to begin to realize how short life is and how much things pass away and just don't last. Relationships, many of them don't last. Companies don't last. Those of you who live long enough can even talk about countries that don't last. These men already made a decision that they didn't want to be part of Babylon. So in one very real sense, they had nothing to lose that day that they had not already decided they were willing to lose before. You want to know why people make hard decisions in difficult moments? It's because they've been preparing for those difficult moments before that moment came. And so, ladies and gentlemen, what you and I have to learn, and young people especially, as you are building the foundation of your life, as you are just beginning to decide who you are and what you're going to do with your life, whether it's who you're going to marry, to where you're going to live, to whether or not you're going to worship God faithfully and regularly, to whether you're going to have a career that takes you into all sorts of difficult and challenging situations. Because listen, young people, some careers are more hazardous to your spiritual health than others. We don't think about that when we're thinking about career. We think about income potential. What a foolish thing to use as the sole evaluator for how you're going to spend most of your waking hours for the next 50 or 40 or 50 years. And so we have to make our commitments before we are already in financial trouble and tempted to fudge. Before we are in the boardroom, the meeting room, the interview room. Before, young people, we walk into that classroom. Before we sign up for that activity, before we get to wherever it is we're going, we have to decide whether we're going to put what God wants first or not. And back to the story then in verse 13, what these young men have done is these men have ticked off the most powerful man in the world. That's what they've done. You just fear making your boss annoyed because you won't work when you need to be at services. You just make your family members annoyed because you won't go to the birthday party or the anniversary celebration because you should be worshiping God or doing something that puts the kingdom first at the same time. These young men alienated a man who literally had their very lives, earthly lives, in his hand. And by the way, Nebuchadnezzar was known for burning people with fire. It was not an idle threat. It talks about that elsewhere in the Old Testament. He had a reputation. He was not a man to be trifled with. And he wanted them to serve my gods. Have your Bible, go back with me now, back to the text. Verse 13, Nebuchadnezzar in a rage, he gave orders. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were brought before him. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, "Is it true? Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my God?" See, Nebuchadnezzar learned nothing from the dream. No matter what it looks like he's saying in chapter 2, he's really learned nothing. Or that you will not worship the golden image that I have set up. Now, if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music. By the way, someone says, why is that repeated over and over and over again? To emphasize, number one, there's no way somebody could miss what's going on. And number two, to emphasize the pressure that they're under to conform. Everybody is there. It is a very huge ceremony. It is very, very public. Very, very obvious what's going on. And when all these things sound again, middle of verse 15, if you will fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? What God can rescue you? What church service is worth it? What moral code is worth it if you ruin your life and miss out on things here and now? You can hear the world in that, can't you? And the temptations that still are pushing us sometimes today. And so in verse 16, it's fascinating. They don't need any time to think about it. There's no, give me 24 hours to think it over, sir. Whether I'm going to take this job or not, whether I'm going to move my family to a place where there's no sound congregation, but the money's better. The kinds of decisions that we make over the course of life all the time. They don't need 24 hours to think it over. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, even though he's literally offering them a second chance to save their lives. "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire." You realize what they're saying right there, right? He's just said there's no God that can save you from you. What are they saying? Actually, sir, I'd like to correct you. He's already angry. How much angry do you want to make the guy? Actually, Nebuchadnezzar, there's a God. He gave you a dream. You ignored that. That's why we're having this conversation. But there is that God who decides when the kingdoms rise and fall and who's really in charge. "If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." It's fascinating, folks. Here they are. And they do not waver. There is no reservation. There is no hesitation. They know exactly what they are going to do, and they are certain of it. They need no moment to think it over. They admit, they confess to Nebuchadnezzar, there is a God. He is able to save us. That's why we worship him and serve him. He is our God. But notice what they say then, the staggering thing they say in verse 18. Did you catch it? Even if he does not. I don't know about you, but that's a part of the story that just never really clicked when I heard this story when I was a kid growing up. Because the challenge is when you know the story already and you've heard it so often and the happy outcome is emphasized. What it's easy to overlook, and this is why this is really a story for adults as much as it is for kids, is that these three men were making a decision in the exact same predicament that you and I are in, which is this. I don't know what God in his providence is going to do or not. I know he can save. I know he can make a way out of no way. But I don't know what he's going to do in my personal particular predicament today. But I'm going to do what's right anyways. Because, ladies and gentlemen, the truth of the matter is what God is looking for among his people is people who will do what's right because it's right. Not because there's an immediate payoff in this life in our exile in Babylon. God wants people who will do what's right, not because we put God as we see it into a predicament where he now has to deliver or else he looks bad. They are prepared to do what's right, which means losing their lives. In a pretty horrible way, I might add. This is not like, dying peacefully in your bed on a morphine drip. This is being burned alive. One of the worst ways to go. And yet they are unwavering in their decision. And the fact of the matter is, folks, that the Bible is very honest about this. We so often emphasize the happy endings and the great stories where God swoops in and miraculously delivers, and those are great stories, and they are meant to show the power of God and the faithfulness of God to his people. Those stories are meant to rebuke men like Nebuchadnezzar, who actually think that their power is greater than the one true God in heaven. However, what we often forget is there are plenty of stories in the Bible where God's people die. We read Hebrews chapter 11 in the first chunk of that chapter so often, and all the great stories of where by faith people did this and God did that. And we often don't read all the way to the end of the chapter, do we? Where it talks about those who experienced mockings and scourgings, chains and imprisonment, those who were stoned, those who were sawn in two, those who were put to death with the sword, those who, if they weren't put to death, simply went through impoverished in this life. They made material, economic sacrifices to maintain their conscience before God. And so they went around in sheepskins, goatskins. They were destitute, afflicted, ill-treated. See, there's more than one way for the world to hurt you. If they don't kill you, they can just cut you out of a good job, a good promotion, a good situation. But these were gained approval through their faith. And part of what the Hebrews point is because people who live by faith, regardless of how their story turns out in this life, are looking for the city whose builder and maker is God. They know that they are pilgrims and exiles. The chapter says this in Hebrews 11. They know that they are pilgrims and exiles on this earth. And so at the end of the day, folks, it's not about the outcome. It's not about us. It's about what's right. Full stop. No explanation. No explanation required. God is as real to them as what they can see and hear and even feel the heat of the flames. And they understand, and we need to understand, that fear of consequences cannot dictate our obedience. What seems to be best for us personally cannot determine the decisions that we make when it comes to obeying our God. Because at the end of the day, what pilgrims and exiles understand is that suffering in this world is only temporary, like everything else in this age. We get that sometimes in our more sober moments. We get the money is temporary, health is temporary, youth is temporary, life itself is temporary. And so we recognize that we need to hold on to some of these things a little more loosely, or be less greedy or desirous of climbing the ladder and grabbing the brass ring. But do we also sometimes then forget that the suffering in this life is just as temporary? And it will pass away just like the possessions. All right, well, let's finish the story. Time is short. Verse 19. So Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath. That's a very soft way, I would think, to put it. His facial expression was altered towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Can you imagine a face of a powerful man twisted with rage? Because that's what we're talking about. And he answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. They're not just going to die. I want them to die catastrophically. And he commanded certain valiant warriors who were with his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. And these men were tied up in their trousers, coats, caps, and other clothes, and were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. For this reason, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew the men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Why is that detail there? To emphasize how unsurvivable, humanly speaking, how utterly unsurvivable the situation is. That the fire is so hot that even the men who had to get close enough to throw the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in, they themselves died from the heat of this furnace. They died, but verse 23, these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. And then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste. Apparently he wanted to watch this spectacle of these rebellious men die and get their just deserts. He said to his high officials, "Was it not 3 men we cast bound in the midst of fire?" And they replied to "Certainly, O king." Not that anybody's going to disagree with Nebuchadnezzar at this point. And he said, "Look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." And that 4th guy looks a little different. You think? Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire, and he responded and he said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out." And now he changes his tune a little bit. Look at what comes out of his mouth. "You servants of the Most High God, and come here." And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and king's high officials gathered, not around an image now, but before a living testimony to the true God, not the false one they've been bowing down to. They all now gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their heads singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. In other words, they emphasize how utterly unaffected they were by what Nebuchadnezzar did to them. Not even the smell of the fire. Listen, we get that, right? There's a barbecue restaurant that, especially before COVID, we used to, my family and I, we'd go to for lunch some Sundays after services. And you spend an hour in that restaurant eating, and then you go home, and you know what you smell like? You smell like mesquite. And that's just sitting in the restaurant. These men have been thrown into a fire so hot that the men who drug them into it were killed. And not even the smell of the fire is on them. So utterly impotent is Nebuchadnezzar and his threats and his claims now shown to be. And Nebuchadnezzar responded, verse 28, and he said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue," so now we're back to Babel language again. Notice that. He tried to, in one sense, assemble the city of man to his image, but by the end of the story, because Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego did what they did, now the Babel horde is now being told, under Nebuchadnezzar's decree, that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap. Nebuchadnezzar never does anything halfway, by the way. Inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. And the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, there's a happy ending. Yes, they prosper. But again, and especially young people, I want you to know this. They prospered not because that was their career goal. They prospered because God saw fit to use them in this way because they were serving him. There's no guarantee that turns out. They could have easily died that day. Because you know what Hebrews 11 reminds us? There's lots of nameless people who died for fear of God. And we don't know their names or their stories, but God does. And there will come a day when by worldly standards, the least of those who have suffered and even died for righteousness' sake will be held by God to greater glory than the greatest of this earth's kings and rulers and billionaires and titans of industry. The language shift here at the end of the story is fascinating, isn't it? We go from early in the story when Nebuchadnezzar talks about my gods and nobody can save you from my gods, to what God, to now servants of the Most High God. By what we do and what we don't do, folks, we teach people about God. The world's not going to read the Bible, folks. They're going to look at us and they're going to learn about God from us. That's the reality of the situation. And now Nebuchadnezzar, he knows where their allegiance lies, and the irony is now he himself confesses their God instead of them confessing his. And it's not that Nebuchadnezzar is really converted in any meaningful way, by the way. That's also true of people of the world. They're impressed. They may say the right things for a while, but there's no real lasting change. Just turn the page to chapter 4 and you find that out real quick. But here's now everyone crowding around them. And Nebuchadnezzar admits that they value nothing more in this world than their relationship with God. Let me ask you, how many people in your life would say that about you? that you value nothing more in this world than your relationship with God. And it shows in how you spend your time and money. It shows in how you behave at work. It shows in how you deal with the various spheres and relationships that you have in your life. But it's very obvious, even to your most vocal critics, that you serve God first and foremost. And let's understand something else, ladies and gentlemen, as the clock is about to catch us here, that this, in one sense, this is an exception story. The point of this story is that, it's not that God is always going to deliver his people from their problems. This story is not a get-rich-quick, stand for God and you will always get rewarded in this life. Stand for God and everything will always work out. That's not the application of this story. The point of this story is, again, that you stand for God regardless. Even though Nebuchadnezzar gets it to a point in verse 28. And even though they, going into it, were not sure whether they would survive or not in verses 17 and 18. The point of this story, the adult point, and the point for young people as well, is you do what's right no matter what. Can God save us from anything? Yes, he can. But will he always get you out of the predicament? No, he won't. He will get you through, but he will not necessarily get you out. And so again, this story, like so many of these stories, is about choosing to not be part of Babylon. That's the point. Take your stand, bear the consequences, and praise God every step of the way. Choosing the eternal over the temporary. Choosing the eternal over this country and its politics. Over jobs, economics, business, even your own personal pleasure, desires, whatever you say, my needs. I need this. No, you need God, and that's the only true need you have. And so very quickly, just 3 quick final observations. What does it mean to be holy? It means to be set apart. And to be set apart means you're going to stick out in the world. That's what this means. Number 2, what you have to ask yourself as you go through your daily life is, are you part of God's plan or are you resisting God's plan? God's plan is not necessarily that you have a rich, comfortable, easy life. God's plan is that you serve him faithfully no matter what, so that he can use you to bear witness to the world, to the gospel of Jesus Christ. The fact that the real categories are not in this world, in this life, are not racial or political or economic, all the different ways and classes that sociologists use to divide us up. The only real categories that matter are sinner and saved. And are you living in the basis of that reality? Are you allowing the world to draw you into one of these other categories and its values and its mindsets and its goals and reasons for living and what a good life looks like? And number 3, everybody's got a weak point. What is it in your life that you know, and certainly Satan knows, is the place where you would be most tempted to bow the knee, to worship the image? What is it, the one thing that you are afraid to lose? Most of us, especially after a certain age, a certain point in life, there's a lot in life that we just realize is fluff. We don't need, we can do without. The longer you live, the more you begin to realize how much fluff and froth there is. But all of us have something in our lives that is so close to the heart of our self-identity, who we think of ourselves as, what we derive meaning or security from. What in your life is it that's tempting you to compromise? God knows, Satan knows, and you need to know that as well. And start practicing in your mind right now that if it needs be, you would be willing to lose that too. Our time is gone. You've listened well. Thank you very much. I'll see you the next hour.